Duffy's Tavern, film, from Wikipedia, the free online encyclopedia at wikipedia.org. Duffy's Tavern is a 1945 American comedy film directed by Hal Walker and written by Melvin Frank and Norman Panama. The film stars Ed Gardner, Bing Crosby, Betty Hutton, Paulette Goddard, Alan Ladd, Dorothy Lamour, Eddie Bracken, and Brian Dunleavy. The film was released on September 28, 1945 by Paramount Pictures. Plot: Duffy's Tavern was another of Paramount's all-star cast films, a large-scale musical based upon characters created by Ed Gardner for his popular radio show, Duffy's Tavern. Archie, played by Ed Gardner, with regulars Eddie Green, and Finnegan, Charles Cantor, was surrounded by many of Paramount Pictures' stars playing themselves, including Robert Benchley, William Bendix, Eddie Bracken, Bing Crosby, Cass Daly, Brian Dunleavy, Paulette Goddard, Betty Hutton, Alan Ladd, Veronica Lake, and Dorothy Lamour. The film's plot involves a war-displaced record manufacturer whose staff, those not sent off to war, drown their sorrows at Duffy's on credit, while the company owner tries to find ways around the price controls and war attrition that threaten to put him out of business. Bing Crosby makes 2 appearances in the film, once to sing with a group, which includes Betty Hutton, Sonny Tufts, Diana Lynn, Billy DeWolf, Cass Daly, and Howard Da Silva, a parody of Swingin' on a Star, and again in a sketch where Robert Benchley tells a bedtime story about Bing to the 4 Crosby boys. He is also heard, but not seen, singing Learn to Croon, Please, and Love in Bloom, when recordings are presented on an on-screen phonograph. It was the film debut of the 4 Crosby boys, other than Gary Crosby's walk-on part in Star-Spangled Rhythm. Cast: Ed Gardner as Archie, Bing Crosby as himself, Betty Hutton as herself, Paulette Goddard as herself, Alan Ladd as himself, Dorothy Lamour as herself, Eddie Bracken as himself, Brian Dunleavy as himself, Sonny Tufts as himself, Veronica Lake as herself, Arturo de Cordova as himself, Barry Fitzgerald as Bing Crosby's father, Cass Daly as herself, Diana Lynn as herself, Victor Moore as Michael O'Malley, Marjorie Reynolds as Peggy O'Malley, Barry Sullivan as Danny Murphy, Charles Cantor as Finnegan, Eddie Green as Eddie the Waiter, Ann Thomas as Miss Duffy, Robert Benchley as himself, William Demarest as himself, Howard Da Silva as Tough Guy, Billy DeWolf as Doctor, Walter Abel as Director, Johnny Coy as Dancer Waiter, Miriam Nelson as Dancer, Charles Quigley as Ronald, Olga San Juan as Gloria, Bobby Watson as Masseur, Gary Crosby as himself, Philip Crosby as himself, Dennis Crosby as himself, Lindsay Crosby as himself, William Bendix as himself, James Brown as himself, Joan Caulfield as herself, Gail Russell as herself, Helen Walker as herself, Jean Heather as herself, and Maurice Rocco as himself. Reception: The film was placed 15th in the list of highest-grossing movies in the U.S. in 1945. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times summarized it as, quote, "Take it for what it is, a hodgepodge of spare-time clowning by the gang, including a large hunk of Archie, and you'll find Duffy's Tavern fair enough," end quote. Film Daily commented, quote, "There isn't much to the story itself, which merely offers an excuse for bringing in such top-flighters as Bing Crosby, Betty Hutton, Paulette Goddard, Dorothy Lamour, Eddie Bracken, Veronica Lake, to name a handful, so that they may do their bit in the manner of guest stars. Most of the big names are introduced at the end in a benefit show staged to raise money to permit Victor Moore to reopen his record factory and put a lot of nice guys back to work." Soundtrack: Swingin' on a Star, sung by Bing Crosby and Group. His Rocking Horse Ran Away, by Jimmy Van Heusen and Johnny Burke, sung by Betty Hutton. He Says Murder, He Says, by Frank Lesser and Jimmy McHugh, sung by Betty Hutton. This article was recorded November 18, 2019.